Good afternoon, Milwaukee. This is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. When you're in the middle of a presidential election, as we are right now, and you have the relatively new phenomenon of the American media just out and out choosing sides and no longer even attempting to report facts, just essentially serving as the advertising wing of one political party, which is what's happening right now. What we had in the past was a media that was biased. Those were the good old days. Bias means they're slanting the news, whether deliberately or unintentionally. We're at a different level now. This isn't news anymore. It's simply putting out information, putting out propaganda, reporting what you think will help one side and hurt the other. When you have that going on in the context of a presidential election, I think it puts an even greater onus on those of us that aren't part of the news media to do the best job that we can communicating what's happening in our world. We're in the middle of a transition in a lot of different industries and a lot of different businesses in our country. When we look back at the decisions that we made in 2020, we're going to shake our heads and wonder how we killed off the restaurant business in the United States, how we killed off the movie business. So many of the others that I think some are going to survive, but most are not. But then there are the others out there about how some businesses essentially destroyed themselves. The news media is destroying itself. It's going to survive as something, but it's not going to survive as the news media. It will probably create, by the time all of this dust settles, which may be years, opportunities for others to come in and replace the news media by doing what the news media used to do. Because let's face it, being the major provider of information in a society is a pretty good place to be if you're running a business. Even with bias, there was a general sense 10, 15, 20 years ago that most of your major news organizations in the country were the place that you would go and find out what was going on. There's an utter lack of distrust of most of those organizations right now by about half the country. Well, it would seem to me that that would create an opportunity for somebody at some point in the future to create an unbiased news organization. I don't mean one slanted from the right. This was an actual pretty good business model that existed for a couple hundred years in this country. A news media that pretty much reported the news and tried to be fair. Who can you say fits that category right now? I almost think no one. Major news organization in the United States that tries to accurately report the news fairly without bias toward either side. I think, as I said, it just doesn't exist. If I was inventing a company, maybe I'd invent one that did that. Now, I'm going off in 2 or 3 different directions on this for a reason. The first point that I made, where you just have the media almost, Democrats put out talking points. Some of them are laughable. Trump's responsible for California burning down. And the next thing you know, the media is reporting on whether or not climate change is causing the fires in California, whether or not that should be an issue in the presidential election. So in other words, an absurd thesis is put forward. And it takes only a day for that absurd thesis to simply now be news. Well, when you have that happening, as I said, there's an even greater onus on people like myself to, if not correct the misinformation that's out there, at least, I don't like the term, but it's the best one I can come up with, give you the slant from the other side. Whether it's time politically or not, the Middle Eastern, it's not fair to say peace deal, but the breakthrough between Israel and some small Arab nations in which they're finally, for the first time ever, recognizing Israel, that's an important news story. We have been wringing our hands about the Middle East really ever since the end of World War II, when the new Israel was created and so on. And the difficulty that that's had and so on. This is one of the biggest breakthroughs ever. You've never had an Arab nation recognize Israel before, and now some are, and there's an indication that more are going to follow. But that story's barely reported as news. Can you imagine if there was a Democratic president who did that? So, if my show spends an extra 5 or 10 minutes on that story, it becomes a necessity because the rest of the media is going to downplay and de-emphasize it, because it doesn't fit their talking point. Their talking point is California's burning to the ground, and somehow this is because of climate change. So all the wildfires that we had before they decide climate change was causing that, and all the wildfires that occurred during Democratic presidents, those are just for different reasons, but this is now because of climate change, and because Donald Trump doesn't believe in the notion of climate change. It's somehow his fault that California is burning to the ground. Somebody has a pretty good point. How come nothing's burning in Canada? Oh, I don't know. Why are we not blaming all of the fires all over the world on Donald Trump? In fact, the whole California problem with the wildfires has been debating forever and ever and ever and ever. Many blame it on environmentalists who believe in, not clearing out brush, not cutting down and clear cutting some of the older timber that is vulnerable, and so on. I'm not going to tell you that I'm an expert on the wildfires. What I am saying is that when you see stories like this, as ridiculous as they are, California run entirely by Democrats, burning to the ground, and somehow it's a Republican president's fault that this is happening. California, which manages all of its forest land, California, which has their version of a DNR, California, which has adamant views about how untouchable so much of this forest land is, and California that is filled with people who act recklessly out in these areas and build in areas that probably shouldn't be built, and all of that stuff that goes on. Somehow this is Donald Trump's fault. Now, this is what happens, again, as I say, when you have a news media that simply decided that they're going to take sides and they're going to be propagandists rather than reporters and put out the spin that they're going to put out. On that other point, I've made a point forever that I think one of the local TV stations in Milwaukee should do newscasts and slant them from the right. And admit it. I think they'd be number one in the ratings. See, what you have now is you have 4 TV stations plus Spectrum. I don't really understand Spectrum's news operation. They seem to run the same 30-minute newscast all day. I don't really understand. What? I just don't really understand what they're trying to do over there. It would seem to me that if they have a 24-hour news operation, that they ought to stress the liveness and always at least have a live anchor, but they don't. It just seems to me that I'll be watching it, and 10 minutes later, the anchor is reading the exact same story that they were reading 10 minutes earlier than that. When I say I don't understand, but I just don't understand what are they trying to accomplish with that thing? Well, but I mean, what niche are they trying to fill? If they're going to run the news 24 hours a day, it would seem to be the only reason to do that would be to constantly update the news and have a constant focus on live and, put a clock there showing what the time is and have the anchor constantly reinforce that. But I don't get what they're doing. So let's not count them. Let's just count the four major television stations in town. 4, 6, 12, and 58. All of them are biased from the left. None of them admit that they're biased from the left. But just about all of us know that they're biased from the left. So since they all are, the bias from the left niche is taken. All of them fill it. You could go another route and you could simply say, we'll be the one that isn't biased at all and we'll try to go down the middle. But why stop there? If biased news is the way we're going to be presenting news, why not just have one station, bias it up from the right? And when I say that, I don't mean not report factual information, but report the stories from a conservative perspective rather than a liberal perspective. And it's easy to imagine some of the ways that you would do that. I think that you get outstanding ratings. Now, I've explained in the past the difficulty in doing that in that you'd have a devil of a time staffing up the news department, finding enough conservatives to be able to work in a news operation, since nobody who's conservative goes into it. Now, part of that is because very few conservatives have an interest in going into the news media anymore because they realize that it's a liberal sewer and they wonder if there's a place for it for them. So you have fewer and fewer and fewer people that are right of center that even try to go into the news business to begin with. So having said all of that, I'm now going to drop it. On the changes in the American economy, we started teeing this up yesterday. I want to approach this on a two-pronged level and then get to the Amazon and Uline hiring spree story. They have bidding wars going on right now. Amazon and Uline are bidding against one another to see who could pay the most money to hire new workers. That's a story that tells you something. As I dive into that, I was mentioning the number of changes that are occurring in the American economy. Some probably would have occurred even if we had not had the COVID situation. Others are occurring because of the COVID situation. But I don't think you can address that story unless you get to the point of, are we ever going to return it to normal? You keep hearing all of these advertisers say, we're going to get through this, we're going to get to the other side, and so on. It seems to me that there are a lot of people who don't intend ever to get us to the other side. Now, I've been asking this question, and I know some people probably think I'm a broken record. What's the end game on this? What's the end game on this? What's the end game on this? Because I just don't see one. And I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. I talked to my brewer sales rep today about, well, what are you going to do with the money that you have refunded from 2020? You're just going to roll that into 2021 and so on. And the first thing that dawned on me is I don't know that the Brewers are going to let fans go to games next year in 2021. I bet the Bucks don't have any live fans this coming basketball season, whenever it's supposed to start. I don't know what has to happen. Some people think it's just the election, that this is all just a farce, that we're trying to panic everybody and wreck the economy so Trump loses. And once the election is over, we're going to return to some sense of sanity and blow the whistle and say, okay, you can resume your normal life and stop running around terrified from a virus that hardly anybody gets sick from anymore. But I don't think that that's true. It seems to me that there's no light at the end of the tunnel at all. Macy's announced yesterday that they're not going to have the Thanksgiving Day parade. That's November. Okay, we're now canceling things that are 2 months away from now. What happened earlier in the year when we started these first shutdowns in March and April, everybody said it's for 30 days. We got to flatten the curve. We can't overwhelm the hospital system. And then it got extended and extended and extended and extended and extended and extended. In some parts of the country, they're trying gradually to open up. Here in the state of Wisconsin, we've opened up some things are restricted, and a lot of things you still can't do. Virtually anything having to do with entertainment is pretty much called off. There's almost none of that kind of stuff that's going on. Anything that has to do with a mass gathering doesn't seem to be going on. And my question is, when is that going to change? And the people who've been doing all of these cancellations, they never answer that question, nor do they ever give you a criteria as to what has to happen for that to occur. We've heard these discussions about, well, if there's a vaccine on COVID-19. And I've been laughing with regard to that. First of all, even if you get, and there's no guarantee that they're going to develop a vaccine that works very well. There's just none. We've got all sorts of things that they've been trying to figure out how to come up with a vaccination for that don't work. And a lot of people think that vaccinations kill you anyway. But even if it occurs, a whole lot of people aren't going to get it. If it's a good vaccine, it's going to be 50 to 60% effective. That means the thing is still out there 40%. A likelier scenario to me has always been that we finally just realize that this thing, other than for people that are in a high-risk situation, is not that serious. And let it roll through society and enough people get it and hopefully develop an immunity that we just move on eventually. This is clearly what younger people are doing, not millennials. They remain running around with their masks on, scared to death to breathe. But the ones that's based on the anger that you're seeing from the high school and college kids now, they've just quarantined another dorm. Marquette Schroeder Hall is being quarantined for 2 weeks. I know these dorms are nicer than the ones that I went to when I was in college. I just can't fathom quarantining a college kid to a dorm for 2 weeks. It's hard to imagine quarantining a kid to a dorm for 2 hours. They don't like to sit still. Well, they're rebelling against this because they've come to realize that this is a great big lie, that coronavirus is not a particularly serious thing unless you're old or have high risks. For most people, the only reason you know you have it is because a test came back and said that you had it. This is the virus that we call so lethal, but for some people, they don't even get sick when they have it. So, other than the rebellion that you're getting from some younger people that are just fed up that their youth is being taken away from them, while we run around canceling everything, hiding behind masks, closing doors, and scaring people to death. But until that attitude gets into the general population, we're just spinning our wheels here. So maybe enough people get it, and it's come to the point that the numbers by definition have to go down because people are going to stop testing positive because they've already gotten it and they develop some immunities, maybe so. But the difficulty that has existed, and if I've been right about anything on this, it's this point that I make about not only coronavirus, but everything else. It's much harder to get out of something than it is to get into something. Like marriage, like lockdowns. You start with, and I know that there's a political agenda driving it, but you start with, well, we've got to flatten the curve. The curve never needed to be flattened because there was never really that much of a spike for the healthcare system other than maybe a little bit in New York. Instead, we tried to we were going to flatten the curve, and we started building the hospitals like that State Fair Park waste of money thing that was built. Did all of these things. We don't allow anybody to come in for cancer treatments and for heart treatments and for all the other stuff. Cancel appointments. Optional stuff is put off unless you're the Milwaukee Health Commissioner, then you can get your knees done, and so on. All for something that never happened. But even though there never was a spike, once that became apparent, we didn't therefore reopen everything up and return to normal because there was no need to flatten the curve because the curve didn't really exist that much at all. Instead, we come up with new criteria. The latest criteria now is to run around and talk about cases. Not hospitalizations, not even sicknesses, but cases. And their definition of cases, of course, is simply a positive test. Trying to argue this becomes difficult in a world in which, as I was referring to earlier, the media has become propagandists. If somebody tests positive for something, is that a case of it? Well, I don't know. I always thought I had a cold when I had a sore throat with sniffling and coughing. What if I tested positive for the virus for the common cold, but didn't have any symptoms? Do I have the cold? I don't think I have a cold. If you test positive for coronavirus, but you have no symptoms, are you sick with coronavirus? I would say no, but they're claiming these are all cases. So we come out with these case numbers, and it just creates a situation in which you wonder, when do we ever get to the end in which we can say, this isn't that big of a deal? So everybody predicted themselves. April of next year, when they have the Brewer opening day, our fan's going to be there. Just don't call in. Just make a prediction yourself. Make a mental note of it. Will people be able to go to Packer games next year? They've rescheduled Summerfest for 3 weekends in a row next year. Will it actually happen? In other words, I'm taking, like 10 months out. At some point, will we finally say, screw it? Deaths in the United States, all deaths, as a percentage of the population are not up. It's an interesting fact, actually. If we supposedly have a plague that's out there killing people, there ought to be a spike in deaths. In fact, there is not. If you take a look at the number of deaths from all flu-like illnesses, including coronavirus, those numbers are up, but not substantially so, and they're up mostly over the last 2 to 3 years because those 2 to 3 years were rather down. Now, I don't want to create the impression that I'm rambling because I'm trying to make a point here about changes that are occurring in the economy. So I'll just cut to the chase. It seems to me that we might be kind of in a sort of permanent situation here with regard to a lot of the things that we used to do. And for those of you who've always dreamed of opening a restaurant, I wouldn't count on ever being able to do it. We see in Milwaukee the number of closures that are going on in the restaurant business is just incredible. And a lot of the ones that are still open, they're not far from closing because they're not getting any business at all. The parts of the area that have had restaurants do a little bit better, those are the ones that are generally seasonal out in the lake country and so on. But I've gotten so many emails of people saying that they're on the verge of closing the doors, that they're getting 10 tables a night. And I don't mean just in the city, I mean all over the place. Well, if that's because people have been scared to death out of going out to eat, whether it's because of restrictions or not, it strikes me that we're not going to get to a point in which anybody says, well, okay, it's safe to do so now, because I think it's been safe to do so all along. So let me get to the whole Uline and Amazon thing. Everybody knows who Amazon is. Not everybody knows who Uline is. Everybody's heard of Uline. Uline makes packaging materials. I've always been attracted in terms of investment to the industries that are in the middle of the pipeline. Everybody takes a look at the one at the end. In other words, if good time to buy cars, I'm always interested in the companies that make the seats and make the hubcaps, because if people are buying cars, well, then there's a need for the suppliers in between. Uline doesn't sell any, well, I shouldn't say anything, but their primary customer isn't the general public. Uline sells to companies that do shipping. They make just about anything that's involved in packaging. They can make the boxes, all that junk that you put inside it, and so on. It's a company that's based in Kenosha County and has been rapidly growing. Amazon is one of its prime customers. Even though Uline services Amazon, and one of the giant Uline facilities is right across the street from the giant Amazon facility in Kenosha, right now they are rivals for one key thing. They're looking for employees. Yesterday, Amazon announced that they were looking to hire, I've got the Wall Street Journal story in front of me, 100,000 new workers essentially immediately. They say that they need to embark, as fast as they've been growing, they need to embark on a rapid expansion. Amazon is projecting that its business is likely to continue to grow exponentially. In other words, that this shift away from people buying things in person and doing things in person is going to accelerate without regard to what happens to COVID. Amazon is building a facility in southern Milwaukee County, and they have 2 large facilities in Kenosha County, so they're doing a lot of hiring here. Well, as I say, as Amazon grows and as the shipping business grows, Uline has to grow as well. Uline is now announcing a $6,000 hiring bonus. You take a look at the number of industries that are struggling. I was talking about the restaurant business. There's so many others that you wonder if they're ever going to come back. You take a look at these giant office towers in Milwaukee that are all still empty. I mean, just pick a high-rise building in Milwaukee that's office-oriented and there's nobody in it. U.S. Bank building's mostly empty. Thousand North Water is mostly empty. The Northwestern Mutual brand spanking new office complex is virtually empty. None of everybody in the 411 building is virtually empty. Some of these companies have had people trickling back to work and so on, but most of them remain empty. But at the same time that that's going on, the factory production at Uline is humming along, and the processing of shipments at the Amazon facilities is roaring forward. Now, what's striking to me about these numbers is that both of these businesses are rather automated. I mean, Amazon has got robots all over the place, but even with all of that, they still can't find enough workers because there's so much business that's rolling through there. So if we're in a situation in which unemployment remains very, very high, why are Amazon and Uline fighting with one another to attract workers? Why don't they have 1 trillion people standing in line begging for a job down there? Well, I did a little bit of poking into that today. I am told that one of the problems is that many of the people that are unemployed are still collecting unemployment benefits, and often they are in jobs in which their unemployment check is still higher than what the starting salary would be at a company like Amazon. So in other words, if you're laid off from a $75,000 a year job and you're still collecting unemployment, even if you're skilled enough to make $35,000 or $40,000 at Amazon, which would be high as an entry-level position over there, you're probably not going to take it because you're making more money off of unemployment. In other words, as it was explained to me by somebody that I can't name but is familiar with the job market, they said it's not going to be until some of these people see their unemployment benefits dry up that they're going to be willing to redirect themselves into another career. And the other thing is, a lot of people don't want to do that kind of work. Would you want to work for Uline? No. Why not? You don't like that kind of work. What kind of work do you like? This? Well, let's suppose you can't do this. Let's imagine we got rid of you. You'd have to look for something else. You wouldn't want to do that? How do you know? Well, okay. But like I say, it is, the point I've been making is this is clearly a permanent move in our society, that we're going to be moving toward delivery of just about everything. And that means the companies that do it and the companies that make all of the stuff that facilitate it are just going to continue to grow. This is Amazon's probably going to grow for the next 30 years, unless they're busted up or unless somebody finally comes forward as a credible competitor to them. The companies that make packaging materials, same thing. And Uline's not the only one. There are several others, including a couple of big companies here in southeastern Wisconsin that make that kind of stuff. These are all fields that are going to see significant growth. And when people think about the jobs that are in place there, they think mostly about those that are in production, but it's across the board. There's human resources jobs. There are jobs involved in legal. There are jobs involved in management of the facility, etc. If you go and take a look at the size just of the Amazon and Uline buildings in Kenosha County, they're just enormous facilities. So all the people that have been spending their time working as waiters in restaurants are eventually going to be people that are working at Amazon and Uline. You're going to see that kind of a shift that goes on, driven, I think, by the fact that many people like to have things delivered to them, and secondly, by the fact that the way that we have reacted to the coronavirus thing and freaked some people out is creating permanent changes in our economy, and I don't know that they're for the better. Now, let me shift gears a bit. Because I'm nicer than most liberals. You don't think that I am. Do you think I'm nicer than most liberals? I just can't be as big a dink as they are. I mean, I'm not, for example, going to torch somebody's building because I'm mad about some political issue. I'm not going to name names here, but I'm going to tell you the community. It's Oconomowoc. Now, you know way more about Facebook than I do. I have no desire to do anything on Facebook other than, you know what I use Facebook for? Yeah, something like, I guess I do that, Paul says, to look up stories of people if somebody's arrested for something. You're right. I do that. That's rare. What would I be more likely to use Facebook for? Well, not even nieces and nephews. Like, I'll sit around and think about somebody I knew 30 years ago, and I'll look and see if they're on Facebook to see what they look like now or something. Colin, just wondering, and one of the reasons I like doing that is they all look terrible. I mean, it's actually kind of shocking when you can do that now. I mean, I think about some people that I haven't thought about for 35 or 40 years. I thought, for example, sitting home last night as I was sort of watching football and sort of watching the Brewer games. 2 Brewer games. They were the exact same game. The Brewers won one of them. The Cardinals won another one. They were the same. They were the same game. Anyway, so I just started thinking about Springfield, where I worked in the early 80s. And I started thinking about some of the people that I knew down there, but I've just probably haven't given them a moment's thought ever since I left Springfield, wondering what they look like. And I started looking them up, and they're, just like everything else, most people look terrible as they get older. So you know way more about Facebook than I do. Apparently, there are a lot of... You can on Facebook create a group where the only people that know what's going on in there are in your group, right? What's the term for that? Just group, or... Paul doesn't remember the term either. In other words, let's imagine, for example, I don't think anything like this exists. Maybe it does. The employees of iHeartRadio in Milwaukee could have like their own kind of like closed loop sort of Facebook group, and people who could post about things in the company. It's something like, no, that's a different thing. But I'm not. I've seen Nextdoor. Nextdoor is like a neighborhood thing. I mean, like people who have a Facebook group. Oh, it's just called Facebook group. Well, anyway, there's one of them in Oconomowoc, and it's mostly a bunch of liberals, and quite a few of them are teachers. Here's the thing about these groups. These people get into these groups, and they will be very, very frank about the things that they post. Posting things and saying things that they probably wouldn't just say on their regular Facebook page where anybody can go and see them. As I've come to learn, there's a flaw in this. There's an assumption that everybody that's part of your group or everybody that sees this is going to be on your side. Well, and apparently that's not true, because somebody, and I'm not going to name who it is, has ratted out this particular Oconomowoc group by taking some screenshot images and sending them to me. See, because I'm not a member, and again, I know very little about how this works, but I'm not a member of the group, so I can't go in there. But anybody who has access to the page can take a screenshot of it and then send me all the evidence of the things that are said there. And that's what has been sent to me. And here's the story. There's a bunch of teachers and other lefties out in Oconomowoc, and they're carrying on ranting and raving about how terrible it is that some people aren't wearing masks. There's a controversy in Oconomowoc about not reopening the schools, and obviously the teachers don't want the schools reopened to the classes and so on. And they're talking about somebody got the virus or somebody got it at such and such a place and so on. Anyway, a couple of the people are coming up with really, really awful, mean-spirited terms for people that they think either aren't wearing masks, or if they own a business, aren't enforcing the mask ordinance. And it's just eye-opening that these are people in a community. They're in Oconomowoc, and they're saying these things about people who live down this, way meaner things than I could ever say on the air about any lefty here. I mean, unless you're talking about somebody who's committed a murder or something. It's just remarkable how vile they were. Paul says they're Facebook Karens. Here's the thing that struck me. One of them, and again, I won't name her, even though I've got the screenshot in front of me. I can tell you that she's not a teacher, but she is somebody that she's a person, and she's of some success, I would guess. It looks like a decent enough job, who lives in Oconomowoc. And she takes a photo. She said that she was going to a restaurant to pick up some carryout. And across the street, she looks at this bar that had a live band. And she took a photo, and she's expressing this disgust. Says, no masks, no social distancing, and then comes up with a really bad term, and she takes a photo of this. And I'm not going to name the place, but it's how many places are there in Oconomowoc that are sort of upscale and would have a live band. And her point is that this is just terrible. Nobody's wearing masks at all inside this bar. They're in a bar. You don't have to wear a mask in a bar if you're drinking. I would guess that the vast majority of the people that were in that bar were drinking. Now, I grant you, some people the rule is if you're not drinking or you're not consuming anything, you're supposed to have your mask on. But I mean, but normally, I barely drink at all anymore, but when I go into a bar, I'm drinking something, seltzer or a soda or something or another, and you can't drink it when you have your mask on, and you're not required to have your mask on when you're actively eating dinner or you're drinking something. So she's taking this photo, appalled that they don't have they're in a bar. How are they supposed to drink their vodka tonic when they've got a mask on? But she sees this and she's so disgusted that they don't have their masks on. She takes this photo. You could easily identify who the people are, list the business, and she says this awful thing about them. Paul says that doesn't she realize this is I know that was the point that struck me on this about that I don't know that we're ever going to get to the other side. She was appalled that some of the things are starting to resume some level of normalcy in society. I don't know what has to happen for people who think the way this woman does and the people who think the way these people at Oconomowoc do, for which they would ever think, A, we can reopen schools with face-to-face, B, that you can go to bars and restaurants and carry on as normal, and C, that we can resume lives without having to wear masks. Because this person is just appalled at a place in which, from what I could tell, it didn't look like anybody was violating a rule. Now, if this was a grocery store, it would have been a violation of a rule. But if people that are in a bar with drinks in their hands and so on obviously don't have to have their masks over their faces. Paul says, and we're not in a lockdown. So I don't believe in Oconomowoc there's any particular local ordinance that was in place that would have restricted this type of activity. Yet this person was just so furious about this. Now, whether we think that she's nuts, and I do, or not, the reality is that there's a segment of our society that's out there that thinks like this. And if they do think like this, I just can't figure out what it is going to be that makes them stop thinking like this. What happens in society where they finally take a deep breath and say, screw it, okay, maybe I'll get sick, but I'm going to have a life. Paul said they don't want, I know, but they don't apparently themselves want to have fun themselves. So, I mean, that's why I asked this question. If they held Summerfest next year, maybe 70 to 75% of the people who would normally go would want to go. But will Summerfest be able to open up because the remaining people just say, no, you can't do it. No, you can't do it. The same thing with going to a ball game. I watched the first football game on Thursday night in Kansas City. They said that they had 12,000 fans there, that's what they limited to. But Lambeau Field won't have any fans this coming Sunday. I watched the Kansas City thing. 12,000 on an 80,000 seat stadium is just a tiny number, but it's at least 12,000 that went. At what point did the Packers say we're going to let 12,000 people go to Lambeau Field? They didn't know. They have not said they're going to have fans in 3 games. They just said that they've canceled it for 2, and we'll decide that. I'm asking what happens that makes them change this, because these COVID numbers are probably going to stay about the same, I think, for a year, until so many people get it that there's nobody left to get it. Now, if we don't develop any kind of resistance, in other words, you get it and you can get it again 4 months later, well, then it's going to be out there forever. It's going to be very much like the common cold or the flu. Paul made a comment. I want to pick up on this for a minute. He said they don't want any of the rest of us to have any fun. That's clear. They seem to be, when they see photos of Sturgis, or when they saw the photos at the beginning of summer of Lake of the Ozarks, when they see this stuff and people they get so mad about this. And my reaction has been, well, you're not at Lake of the Ozarks. You're not going to get sick from them. What do you care? You're not at Sturgis. What do you care? If you don't want to go there, why are you so upset that some other people are doing it? And I've been thinking about that for about a week and a half. Is this that their whole goal is simply for people to be miserable, that they want to take away experiences that people enjoy doing? Is that it? Or are they jealous that they see things that they themselves would like to do, but they really can't do because they're so tied into this ideology that we shouldn't be doing it? I know that's a convoluted way of putting the sentence out there. Before I go to the break, let me explain it. I'm guessing that some of these people that are looking at people having fun want to do the same thing themselves. Like maybe that woman who took the photo of the bar at Oconomowoc where the people were standing there watching the live music, maybe she wishes she was able to do that herself. But she can't do it because she's so tied into this notion that we have to have masks and social distancing and this is a terrible thing that's going to kill us, that she's just very, very jealous that others don't have those same hang-ups. Now, if that's the case, you can simply end it by changing teams and simply deciding that you're not going to be somebody in favor of locking anything down anymore. But it would mean that they're no longer part of the same group that views the world the same way that they do. I hope you all followed that point because I don't have time to explain it again. Do you understand what I'm saying by this or not? In other words, let's imagine I'm one of those people that's blowing the whistle and appalled at all these people that are having fun. I see Paul at a ball game or something or another, and I said, what a disgusting slob he is going to that game. Terrible, terrible. And it's really just because I want to go to the game myself, but because I, for the last 9 months, if I was one of these, was saying you shouldn't be doing it, you shouldn't be doing it, you shouldn't be doing it, I can't just switch off without joining this team of people who say screw it and be out there on the other side. And if they want this to be the world that we live in, there are enough of them that entire industries are going to remain permanently affected. I mentioned the Amazon and the Uline story. I've been talking about how I just can't fathom having groceries delivered to me, but I bet it's going to happen. I mean, what's that thing that I bought? I keep wanting to call it a skiffer. What's that thing that I bought yesterday? Swiffer. The light bulb started to go out over me when I realized that it would be really stupid to go to the drugstore and buy, what's this called, a skiffer or a Swiffer? Swiffer. I bought this Swiffer because I was told I needed a Swiffer. I didn't know what a Swiffer was. I grabbed my phone. Paul, I bet it took me less than 10 seconds to buy it on my phone on Amazon because I got the one-touch buying. Well, why? And it shows up right at my door. Why would I go to the store to buy it again? Well, if I'm willing to do that with regard to what's that thing called, a skiffer? Swiffer. I'm now going to deliberately not remember this ever. See, now you know what it's like to be Joe Biden's aide, so you have to just keep telling him what it is. You think, okay, fine. You think Joe Biden knows what a skiffer is? Swiffer? Yeah, I agree with that. Commercial real estate in general, there's just going to be incredible shakeups. These downtown office towers and so on, are they ever going to have people back? Now, there is a story that we're going to get to next. Some interesting comments from JP Morgan Chase about what's happening to the workforce the longer they're in a stay-at-home mode. And not surprisingly, some of them aren't very productive. So we're going to pick up on that next. And it was a topic I was almost tempted to take some calls on, but I'm not sure if I'm going to. Let me finish off that point, though. If it becomes a no-brainer to me, I needed one of these. It's a Swiffer. I should probably explain for those of you who weren't listening yesterday. It's this thing that it's like kind of like a mop, but for hardwood floors, in which you just brush it along there, and instead of sweeping it like a broom does, it just collects on this bottom little contraption, and it's a sheet that and I've never seen one before because I've never really needed one before, and I thought it's just an ingenious thing. So I had to order them, and it comes because I have Prime. It showed up Actually, it showed up in 1 day rather than 2 days. And I thought it was an easier thing to order it that way than make a special trip to go to the drugstore and get one, or go to the hardware store, or go to the grocery store, or whatever they would have them. So the next step for me probably is simply going to be to do my groceries that way. If I'm willing to do that way, I just can't get myself yet to the point, but I bet I move in that direction. You know what it reminds me of? Remember when I had that resistance to Uber and Lyft when they came out? I said, I can't wrap my arms around this. It seems to me that it's no different than hitchhiking. It just seemed weird that I'd be getting into somebody else's car that I don't know and trusting them with my life to drive around. But you know, nobody uses it anymore because there's nowhere to go. But I fully embraced it once I got past it, and I started to use it all the time. And I suspect the same thing would happen with grocery delivery. So if a guy like me, older, and a holdout on something like this, and just thinking that having groceries delivered to you is the ultimate sign of laziness, if I'm open to it, it means eventually everybody's going to do it. And we're moving toward a society in which we just have things delivered to us, and very few people go to retailers of any sort to buy anything. Well, if nobody's going to go out to get anything, do we need to have stores, or will the grocery chains simply have warehouses that they deliver things from, rather than have to have all these places where they line everything up and people are walking around with their carts and so on? I mentioned that yesterday, that the Amazon and Prime trucks are everywhere. They're just Paul said, aren't lefties bothered by that? They probably are. Eventually they will be bothered by it, but it's never dawned on them when they shut everything down that all you're doing is having trucks running around in society, belching out fumes and so on. Amazon is, they've got a massive deal with Rivian. They want their vehicle fleet to be all electric for obvious reasons. I mean, it's a lot of fuel costs that they have when they're running around. Those will look like very fuel efficient vehicles. Anyway, I want to get to that whole point about productivity in the workforce for people that are not coming into work because their employers still don't feel as though it's safe for them to work together. Joke as it is. Northwestern Mutual doesn't think it's safe for their employees to come into work at that building, but Amazon has them packed into their distribution centers, packaging, putting all the stuff together. Why is it safe to work at Amazon but not safe to work at Northwestern Mutual? That's the illogic of all of this, but it's the world that we currently live in. Well, the same thing. You know, the people that are appalled at this would never say that they're appalled at seeing a bunch of rioters running around. By the way, I'm completely on top of that thing in Kenosha last night. Take a guess as to who might have bailed out the woman that was arrested in Kenosha. Well, I haven't nailed it down yet, but suffice to say that the protesters in Kenosha and the protesters in Wauwatosa, they're the same people. The Wauwatosa crowd was down there in Kenosha. That's all this is. All it is. Anyway, 354 News Talk 1130 WISN. News Talk 1130 WISN. Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Let's transition here. The work at home mode, which is one of the revolutions that's occurred because of the COVID lockdowns. Right now, listening to me, there are no doubt a lot of you that have been, for the last number of months, you've not been laid off, you still have a job, but you are working from home. Here at our own company, it's still the majority of the non-on-air employees. Some of them are now coming back into the building for like a day or so, but most of our salespeople, office people, and so on are in a work-at-home mode, and this would be the norm, I would think, for most people who work in office-type jobs. I suspect that most office-type employment in the United States is still in a work-at-home mode. I don't want to name individual companies, but when you think of the big employers that we have in southeastern Wisconsin, if they're not places that the employee is hands-on making something, chances are they've been at home. We've been talking about the big downtown Milwaukee office buildings. These office towers, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 stories, etc. Most of the people who work in those fields are working at home. Accounting firms, law firms, insurance companies, they remain primarily in a work-at-home mode. We've never tried this before. So we never knew what was going to happen until we did it. An interesting story today on Bloomberg. I'll quote it. A troubling pattern emerged as most of J.P. Morgan Chase and Company's employees worked from home to stem the spread of COVID-19. Productivity slipped. Work output was particularly affected on Mondays and Fridays, according to findings discussed by Chief Executive Officer Jamie Dimon in a private meeting with Keene, Bryant, and Woods analysts. That, along with worries that remote work is no substitute for organic interaction, is part of why the biggest U.S. bank is urging more workers to return to offices over the coming weeks. The WFH, work from home lifestyle, seems to have impacted younger employees, and overall productivity and creative combustion has taken a hit. KBW's Brian Kleinhans wrote in a September 13th note to clients, citing an earlier meeting with Dimon. So, J.P. Morgan Chase's head, Jamie Dimon, met with these analysts. A private report was prepared on the basis of it, and Bloomberg got their hands on it. J.P. Morgan Chase is saying, and they're a giant financial company, that they are finding that the productivity from individual workers is down, especially on Mondays and Fridays. Again, that would seem logical, with people in a work-at-home mode. Now, I haven't read this entire report, and I don't know all of the reasons that they cite. Is productivity down on Mondays and Fridays simply because some people don't start working until later in the morning on Monday when they're working at home? Do some people just quit at noon on Friday? Or are they not mentally dialed in on Monday and Friday because they're at home, as opposed to if they are at work and they're given an assignment by a boss that's physically there or said you have to complete, do this, that, or the other thing? It's very tempting to try to take your own personality and apply it to others. But we know that we're all different. I'm somebody who theoretically could do my show from home. In fact, a lot of people who do talk radio do it from a remote location. I've never asked to do so, although, as I said, if it ever became necessary, we could do it. The reason I haven't asked to do so is I find, and it's a weird thing, but I know who I am. I know that when I come into the station and come into my office, I'm going to be more productive than if I try to do the same things at home. Now, I can do a lot of my show prep at home, and I have done that when I need to. But I'm just more focused when I'm at work. There's less distractions. I'm there. The TV isn't going to be on. I'm sitting in my office. I'm going to do my work-oriented stuff. Plus, there's just to me something psychological of you're at work, therefore you should be working. Now, I could do the same farting around in my office that I would do at home. I could go look around on the internet and follow something on sports or do this, that, or the other thing. I just find that I'm less likely to do it. I also think in terms of doing my show, I am more comfortable being on the air when I am in my studio than if I was just sitting in some sort of room somewhere. So my choice is based on where I think I would do my job better. But let's imagine I didn't care that much about how well I do my job. I'm in a field where if I don't do my job well, I'm going to suffer financially and suffer career-wise because I'm in an incredibly competitive business. But what if you're just like somebody who's in middle management somewhere and the results of your work are a little bit more anonymous? Maybe you don't care as much. We've been told anecdotally that a lot of people that are working at home really like it. Well, maybe one of the reasons they really like it is because they don't have to work as hard when they are at home. Paul says Netflix is right at the whole thing. I was struck by the fact that when you think of the major employers in the state, the most liberal major employer we have, no doubt, is Epic. Judy Faulkner is a major lefty. She announced several weeks ago that Epic was going to begin to require their employees to return to work at their giant complex in Verona. She backed down after there was overwhelming objection. If you think she's liberal, imagine what the employees are. This is Dane County. And they didn't want to do it. They said, it's not safe, it's not safe, it's not safe, and she backed off. But why did she push for it in the first place? You would think if there was a field in which it'd be possible for employees to be about as productive at home as at work, it would be a field like Epic. Epic is involved in putting medical records online. It's a giant business. It's come to dominate that industry. There had to be a reason that Faulkner and the people who run Epic believed that the employees, they'd be better off if the employees were at work, and maybe they noticed the same problem with lack of productivity. The other thing that Jamie Dimon mentioned in the report that I just quoted, that lack of creative spark. I'm not somebody who's big on the whole get a bunch of people around in a room together and start brainstorming, but obviously that isn't really going to, and you say, well, you can do it on Zoom, you can have a virtual meeting, and the nature of it is that it just isn't the same. Are you as competitive when you're sitting at home as when you're at work? I suspect that a lot of businesses are going to come to the conclusion that they're not getting as much done with people at home, and that's one of the things that might start to force this return to work. To this point, though, that Epic faced, well, what if the employees simply rebel and say they don't want to do it? The weaker the economy is, the greater the ability of the employer to have them come back, but no employer wants to run the risk of losing zillions of employees who say, no, I'm just not going to come back in. If you had the choice, would you rather work at home? Paul said no. Paul said he always thought he would say yes, but now he doesn't. Why? Your wife does well. Your wife has a job. She's in real estate though, where she's not really based anywhere anyway, right? So I mean, so I don't think her thing much changed. If you're in real estate, you're just floating around, and you might be sitting in an office for a period of time, but that's only when you're not doing anything else. You could be sitting anywhere. I live by myself, and I wouldn't want to do it. And you'd be sitting there, there'd probably be at least one other person, her and maybe one of your kids, and something going on and a dog running around in the backyard. I just don't think a person would be as productive. Now, the flip side of that is, what if you're enjoying yourself better and you get to stay at home and you can get up and you don't have to dress up and you can get up at the time that you want to do and so on. But that's a separate question from whether or not the employer is getting the same bang for the buck out of you. Now, I look at our own company, radio. Even the people that are not on the air are also in a competitive type of environment. In radio, most of the people who aren't on the air are involved in sales. Well, salesperson isn't selling, they're not producing. So if the salesperson sloughs off, they harm themselves, given that most of them work in a commission-oriented structure, so they have an interest in working as hard as they would otherwise do. Furthermore, sales, like Paul's wife, that's another kind of job where it's pretty easy to switch over to kind of a work-at-home mode, because the salespeople are often not in the building anyway themselves, and being at work just means that's where your desk is, and it's where you make your calls or where you send out your emails and so on, as opposed to some of the other fields that we mentioned. The people that are resisting returning to work, are they resisting returning to work because they're afraid of getting COVID, or they're resisting returning to work because they simply like not having to come into work? My guess is that it's a little bit of both. Rationalization is the second strongest human drive. So if you really don't come back into work and you don't want to say, and you can't just say, well, I'm so lazy, I don't want to come back into work. You come up with the rationalization that I just don't think it's safe to come back into work. We're all going to get COVID, and that's a terrible thing. So therefore you can't make me come back. Tempted to take calls on this topic to hear from people that are in this mode, but I want to move on and not belabor the point, so we'll move forward here. We've got some more information that I want to share with you about how the NFL did over the weekend, and I'm going to give you the short little bullet point here. The ratings for the Sunday night game were terrible. I don't see anything yet from the Monday night game, but the Monday night is always weird the first weekend of the season because they have two games. But the Sunday night game, which is the marquee NFL game, the Sunday night game was down 36% from last year. However, the Sunday afternoon games were about the same as last year. Now, let me do the whole thing right here. Maybe I can expand on it after the break. One of the things, and I don't know what the answer is. I really don't know. We know that all sorts of people have blown smoke saying that I'm done with the NFL. I'm not going to watch. I'm not going to watch. I'm not going to watch. But we also know this. The only people that are going to comment are the ones that are going to say I'm not going to watch. I haven't had a single person send me an email, Paul, saying, I'm going to keep watching the games. It's not something you would normally say because somebody would say, well, so what? Okay, whoop-de-doo. You only are going to hear from the people who say that they're not going to. But is that a lot of people or is it just a very, very loud minority? What I'm speculating on is that people will continue to watch their own team. In other words, most Packer fans probably watch the game on Sunday the way they normally would. But are they going to watch the second game? Are they going to tune in for the Thursday night game? Are they going to watch the Sunday night game? That, in other words, you might watch less football, but you're going to watch your own team. That might be one of the reasons why the Sunday afternoon ratings, there's 10 or 11 games on Sunday, that those turned out to be about the same. The other factor that occurred this Sunday is one of the more interesting matchups probably of the season was on Sunday afternoon, and that was the first game in which Tom Brady is playing with Tampa. Now, that's the sort of game that even somebody that's really hacked off at football might be curious to watch. The Tampa Bay New Orleans game was a Sunday afternoon game. It wasn't the night game, and that might have contributed to where the ratings were on that. Maybe a better test is going to be what happens in weeks 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. I mentioned that the ratings for the Sunday night game on NBC were down 30% from game one of last year. As I mentioned, it's hard to make an immediate conclusion that that's because fans don't like the protesting, because there's so many different variables that are going on. Now, there's a story in today's Wall Street Journal that points out that we've never had as many sports going on at one time as we do right now. We had months in which there was nothing in the United States, and now, everywhere you look, is there any sport that isn't going on right now? You not only have some college football and the entire NFL, Major League Baseball is winding down its regular season, the NBA playoffs are going on, the National Hockey League playoffs are going on. Both major auto racing circuits, IndyCar and NASCAR, are going on at full strength. All this stuff, of course, without fans, but the seasons are all going on. So there are so many different things that people can watch, including more competition for football than there would normally be. But then there is the messaging, which has angered a lot of people. There's a lot of interesting things that are written about this. The one that I want to share with you here is written by Jimmy Fallon, who is a sports talk show host for Fox, and this piece appeared on Fox's website. He writes, the NFL kicked off Sunday with 0 fans in the stands. It was a jarring sight, unless you're a Jets fan, in which case it looked like your average December home game, albeit with fewer people being talked down from the roof. The good news for the league is fans may be able to return to stadiums later this season if social distancing measures ease up. The bad news is many of them won't, because they're exasperated from the ongoing social justice crusade in pro sports. A recent Gallup poll found that for the first time ever, the sports industry has a negative image among U.S. adults, with just 30% viewing pro sports positively, while 45% viewed them negatively. Let's stop for a moment. That's stunning, really. Can you imagine prior to right now ever a situation in which most Americans viewed pro sports as a negative thing? Only 30% of Americans say that they view pro sports positively. 30%. Well, the games haven't much changed, have they? So what's changed? We know what's changed. The messaging coming from the teams and from the athletes. Fela continues, for anyone who doesn't think protests are a driving force, those numbers represent a 30% decline in the league's favorability rating from a year ago. So 1 year ago, 60% viewed pro sports favorably. 1 year later, it's down to 30%. Back to the piece. None of this is good news to me. I absolutely love watching sports. I spent most of my 20s paying my rent and not paying it from gambling on them. For that reason, I'm not going to write the zillionth column of the year bashing players for exercising their First Amendment right. But I am going to make a good faith suggestion that they run a different play because the current one isn't working. Ratings were down 16% for the NFL season opener on Thursday. If that weren't enough of a wake-up call for the wide world of activist sports, a Hill Harris poll found that 38% of fans say they're watching fewer NBA games because of, quote, the increased politicization of the sport. Yes, as shocking as this might sound to a generation that turned Sports Center into Woke Center, the reason most people tune into a sporting event is that they really love watching sports. We don't turn to pro athletes to tell us there are injustices in the world. We turn to them to provide us a badly needed escape from them. Right now, sports isn't providing that escape, which explains why the average fan looks more lost than Joe Biden without a teleprompter. All of that could change if pro sports returned to what they were in their heyday. A piece of common culture that allows us to put our differences aside and remember that at the end of the day, we're all Americans who love a good ball game. I'm not asking players to abandon their admirable quest to improve the quality of life for Black Americans. I'm asking them to stop bashing the country that's enabled NFL players to earn an average salary of $2.7 million a year and NBA to earn an average of $7.7 million. And invest more of those riches in low-income communities where the lack of economic opportunity directly correlates to higher rates of violent crime. I'm asking them to increase investments in the broken education system that have been failing inner city kids for far too long. I'm asking them to stop telling the Black community you're with them and show them you're with them. Protests haven't improved anyone's life. And they certainly haven't pushed Washington any closer to passing police reform. Democrats refused to negotiate the Justice Act put forth by South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, which means for all the noise being made about the issue, nothing is being done. Perhaps instead of symbolic gestures, players could push Democratic leadership to act before the election, because if we're really going to take this movement seriously, the people should come before the politics. And while players are in Washington, they'd be wise to swing by the White House, because for all the media howling about President Trump being a racist, he certainly is not governing like one. Not only did this administration create $75 billion in opportunity zones for low-income communities, but President Trump also signed an executive order giving historically Black colleges and universities their highest annual endowment ever at $100 million per year. These measures, coupled with the First Step Prison Reform Act, have tangibly improved the quality of life for hundreds of thousands of Black Americans. Former New York Giants coach Bill Parcells famously coined the phrase, "You are what your record says you are." You can hate President Trump's rhetoric all day, and many of you do, but his record of governance says he's committed to helping the Black community. One of the most stirring images from last week's 9/11 remembrances was the video making the rounds on social media of then-President George W. Bush throwing out that first pitch before Game 3 of the 2001 World Series. I was in Yankee Stadium that night, although to be fair, the pilot of the Goodyear blimp had a better view than I did from my seat in the last row of the right field upper deck. You know it's a higher seat when the beer guys appear to be wearing a parachute, but I'll never forget the roar that rattled the rafters when the president threw a perfect strike and signaled to the world that America was back. 57,000 fans screamed themselves senseless, and at that moment, the awesome power of sports to unite us all was on full display for the world to see. Here's the deal, pro athletes. We're living in an age where America desperately needs fewer hecklers and more cheerleaders. Anyone can protest this country, but you guys aren't just anyone. You might be the only group with the awesome superpower to unite it, which is why I'm urging you to call an audible. Put the focus back on the game and put your success back into the community. That's something we would all stand for. That's Jimmy Fallon. The piece appeared on, actually, Fox Sports' website. A comment from me about it. Well, I agree with him, obviously, but it isn't going to happen. We're living in an era because of social media and everything else that everybody wants to shoot off their mouth. But very few people want to actually do anything. The whole Black Lives Matter movement, as I've argued, is false. The real problems of Black America don't have anything to do with police officers shooting African American citizens, because it rarely happens. The real problems in Black America deal with black on black crime, a failing educational system, broken families, poverty, and so on. But dealing with that is as difficult for an athlete to do as anybody else. So instead, you shoot off your mouth, pose for holy pictures, and act as though you care. The problem with it is, of course, it doesn't solve anything, and it's not your job to show off that you care. It's your job to play professional sports. It's your job to entertain the rest of us. And if you stop entertaining us and you simply alienate us by throwing around all these political messages when you're supposed to be entertaining us, it's a foregone conclusion that some people are going to stop watching. I don't think it's going to change. It might change if the owners of the sports teams realize that their economic model is starting to go to crap, with their focus on social justice worrying and not entertaining the public. As for the athletes themselves, the suggestion that LeBron James, instead of shooting off his mouth, and George Hill, instead of shooting off his mouth, might invest money in African American communities, might encourage an improvement in the quality of public schools in those communities, and might serve as better role models by encouraging people to stop engaging in antisocial and destructive behavior. You can say it and you can demand it, but the chances of it happening are very, very slim. It's 4:31 at News Talk 1130 WISN. Standing up for Milwaukee, this is the Mark Belling late afternoon show on News Talk 1130 WISN. And I want to belabor this point, but some of the reactions that we've gotten on this whole issue of the work at home, I'm just going to share one of them here. This is from a listener. The work from home is a colossal failure. I have been dealing with one of Milwaukee's largest health systems. Well, that narrows it down to about 2 or 3 companies. He names it, but I won't. And many of these work from home individuals seem to be barely working at all. Getting in contact with someone at times is nearly impossible. Fridays are a black hole where almost no replies or communication is ever given. And an out-of-office automatically reply notices are set up before 3 p.m. All phone numbers go to voicemail in an office that is never visited and therefore almost never checked. The worst of all examples was an email received saying to look out for a follow-up email shortly, which then arrived a week later. The guy signs it. It's one of the things that Paul and I probably don't know because we don't really have to deal with anybody other than ourselves. And in terms of my own gathering of information and so on, it's more driven. I still make a lot of phone calls, but it's more driven by email than it is by phone calls. So we don't really know, but I can tell you that one of the things that historically has stopped employees from sloughing off on Fridays is when they were in a place of business and having to be it, their boss would see if they weren't there or could see if they were goofing around. If you work in a white collar type job and you're working at home, how does your boss walk past your office to see if you're actually there or if you have ducked out early? This is kind of freeform coming off the top of my head, but here at our station, we have a few days during the year in which they, obviously it doesn't apply to the on-air people, but they dismiss early, like the day before Thanksgiving. Usually they let the employees go home at noon on a Wednesday, right? That's a kind of thing that a lot of office-oriented businesses have done for some time. They have an early dismissal. Well, I think what you're seeing right now is that people are dismissing themselves. The employer was willing to let people leave at noon on a Wednesday. This coming Thanksgiving, how many of those people will work at all on a Wednesday? And it's not like they're putting in for vacation. It's very, very hard to check up on them. Now, I would guess that if you're in a field in which you're assigned to do a bunch of tasks and you have to have them done, the ability to slough off is a little bit more limited. But in some of these other areas where you're dealing with other people in a back and forth, and you're part of a big, giant kind of massive glop, if you know what I mean, like working in a healthcare system, and somebody's trying to get information from you and so on, like the guy who was contacting you, it probably is a lot easier to slough off. So from the perspective of the employer, if they're finding that they're simply not getting as much work done, and they think that the reason is because when you allow people to work at home, a lot of them are just going to gold brick, it's another incentive to start getting people back into offices. I take a look at a company like Northwestern Mutual, which spent all of that money to build that mega office complex in downtown Milwaukee. They made that major investment that they weren't going to expand to the suburbs. Their commitment was going to be in the city, and they decided that they were going to build one of the most attractive office buildings really in the United States. And they put in the daycares, all the stuff that's in there. Beautiful, gleaming building, incredible landscaping. And nobody's been in it for months. Is Northwestern Mutual, and I don't know the answer. Are they finding that their productivity is down? They've laid off a lot of people because they've suffered because of the pandemic. But are those layoffs a function of their business simply in decline? Maybe they'd be laying off a lot more were it not for the fact that the workers that they have aren't really getting all that much done. Again, I don't know the answer to that. But when a company decides to spend that much money on an office headquarters, you would assume that that's because they think having people in an office is a good idea. Let's tie this up. If work at home was such a brilliant idea in corporate America, why didn't we do it before the pandemic struck? And I realize some businesses were. I mean, and there are some jobs in which that's just the nature of the job. And I think a lot of sales positions are kind of like that. But for other people that work in all of these other fields in which they're now at home, if it was such a great idea for the company, you wouldn't think that anybody would have been, paying rents to have high rise, space in high rises in Manhattan, or building their own office building as some people have done. What was the point of putting all of this resources into having a workplace for people if there was no need for them actually to be there? The latest company to announce a major round of layoffs. The story is breaking this afternoon. Kohl's is laying off hundreds of employees at its corporate headquarters in Menomonee Falls and elsewhere. Kohl's has corporate employees that are beyond just the Milwaukee area location. They've got a presence, obviously, in the major cities in the United States. They're reducing their staffing at the corporate level by 15%. Now, everybody knows that one of the industries that's been really hard hit has been retailing. Retailing was struggling in the United States even before COVID-19. For a lot of reasons, the biggest being the transition in the economy going away from brick and mortar and toward online. The only retailer I shouldn't say only. One of the retailers that has thrived is Walmart. They not only have a huge online business, but ever since COVID-19 came around, their brick and mortar store traffic has also been strong. Everybody comments on they go to a Walmart and they can't believe how many people are in there. Walmart is a retailer that seems to have handled all of this just fine. Most of the mainline type department stores are really struggling. Macy's is in bad shape. JCPenney filed for bankruptcy. Sears is essentially out of business. Are there any Sears stores left? I think the company still exists, doesn't it? There's no actual evidence of it. Kohl's has struggled for several years. And we followed the Kohl's story on my program extensively because it's such an important local company. And in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was a spectacular American success story in the field of retailing. Kohl's developed a business model that was brilliant. Everybody was either going high or low. And Kohl's tried to grab the best of both sides. The Kohl's strategy was to provide very, very big value. In other words, inexpensive prices on above average quality items. In other words, you weren't going to buy the kinds of things that you might see at Nordstrom, but maybe as good of the stuff as you would see at Macy's, but you'd be paying Walmart type prices. That's what Kohl's model was. And obviously they found a major niche. The company was wildly successful in the Midwest, and they rolled out nationally and had this huge expansion, and the stock price went up and up and up and up and up until everything stopped. Now, I commented that long before the pandemic, Kohl's, I think, under the former CEO, lost its way, in which they tried to become something that they never were. They wanted to be hip. Let's get J-Lo to design products, and let's abandon our Midwestern roots and let's try to be a trendy kind of company, and it just didn't work. The current CEO, Michelle Goss, came in from Starbucks. And whatever her marketing or corporate strategy is, nobody's been able to figure out. Under her, Kohl's has become even more politically correct. They are so focused on social justice issues, bashing cops, and posing for doing a lot of virtue signaling for people on the coasts, none of which seems to be focused on providing an experience for their customer. See, the thing about Kohl's is there's nothing sexy about their business. I mean, they're glorified dollar stores is all they are. They put up four walls. They lay out the items sort of attractively and sort of conveniently, but the stores were never splashy. They were never like attractive places. They weren't like going down to IKEA where you sit there and eat the Swedish meatballs. You go in there and you got your 95% off coupon. You find your value buy, you stock up the thing, and you go and check yourself out. That's what Kohl's has always been. And they tried to remake the entire company, which is all bad enough. But then coronavirus came in. And Kohl's is really hurting. You add to this the lack of effectiveness of people that are in a work-at-home mode, as a lot of the Kohl's corporate employees are. And I don't want to overreact to this, but I'm hoping, and I don't think you can rule it out, is Kohl's the next Penny's? Is Kohl's the next Sears? Is Kohl's the next Kmart? We've had a lot of chains that seem to be dominant that have gone under. I don't know what the answer is, and I've said for several years I don't know what the answer or the end game is for American retailing, because it seems to be driving toward people buying almost everything online, and so many of these companies are brick and mortar focused, and Amazon has taken up such a huge chunk of the online business, and Walmart has grabbed what's remaining, that I don't know what the future is for any of them. But when they've lost their focus on what the customer is besides, in addition to the fact that the way in which shoppers do their business has changed, I just wonder. But when you take a look at the reaction that Kohl's had to the shooting in Kenosha, in which the company immediately decided that this was a murder, put out a statement referring to the shooting of an unarmed man, which wasn't true, and then you take a look at who the Kohl's shopper is, it seemed to me to be tone deaf. Well, if the management and leadership of the company is tone deaf, I could tell you that ever since, for the last several years, I can't get an answer to any question that I ever put to Kohl's. Kohl's has decided that answering questions from someone like me is too much trouble for them. They're not going to mess with me. They're not going to bother with me. Yet the people who listen to my program are probably kind of the core of what was the Kohl's shopper base. So you have a combination of losing your focus on your customer, at the same time these external factors are coming in that are really affecting all of retailing, and then you add in the pandemic, which saw a lot of your stores having to be closed. And remember, in Wisconsin, and this was similar in other states, Kohl's was closed when Walmart was open, given the stupid way in which Tony Evers crafted his order. So anyway, major layoffs today at Kohl's, and if there's light at the end of the tunnel there, I I don't see it. There's two companies that I'm just really pessimistic about, based in southeastern Wisconsin, in which I just think everything has kind of changed on them. One is Harley Davidson and the other is Kohl's. The one thing you could say about Harley is if we're going to be moving away from mass gatherings and live events and so on, maybe it'll get younger people to rediscover the notion of motorcycling, the ultimate social distancing activity. Maybe so. News Talk, 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Here's an issue that's apparently going to come up as long as I'm doing my program. They're once again proposing a burning ban in Brookfield. This has been 30 years of this thing. Every few years it seems to come up, and maybe this will be the time that they actually pass it. The issue it's most places in the United States that are like Brookfield ban open burning. Brookfield has continued to allow open burning. And the reason that it has is because they've always allowed it. Now, the way our society works is, in the places where a lot of people live, you can't burn stuff. If you live out in the middle of nowhere, you can burn stuff. That's been kind of the rule forever. If you live like in the sticks, you can burn whatever you want to burn. Paul says he can burn. If you live in Wauwatosa or Milwaukee, you can't burn. The thing that happened with Brookfield was Brookfield used to be, many years ago, the sticks. There used to be like a gap that wasn't all filled in. And there were, there's still some farmhouses out in Brookfield. And historically, Brookfield was a community that you could burn in. But as society has suburbanized and people have moved from other places into Brookfield, they come in and they're horrified when they see their neighbor burning stuff, and they can't believe that like a mile away from a big giant shopping mall, you got somebody burning stuff in their backyard. So it's been brought up again and again and again, and apparently the city council is once again going to consider a burning ban. And it's an issue on which I have no opinion one way or another. These are issues in which communities can decide for themselves whether or not they want to allow it or not. And there isn't really a rhyme or reason toward who allows it or who isn't, although generally speaking, the more wide open and rural the community, the likelier they are to allow it. And the more dense it is, the smaller lot sizes and so on, the less likely they are to allow it. But in Brookfield, this thing comes up forever and ever and ever and ever. Some people are horrified that their neighbors are burning all of this crap, and other people are horrified that their freedoms are now being restricted to the point that somebody's telling them that they can't go and burn stuff. Well, yeah, this is the two times people burn things are the spring and the fall. Well, in fact, I'll tell a story about that, as long as you jog my memory here. When I moved to Springfield, Illinois, I mean, that's a city of, at the time when I moved there, city of about 120,000 or so, and a state capital. And I don't remember if it was the spring or the fall, but it was one of those, like, kind of dampish sort of days. And I went outside, and it was like being in Los Angeles in 1968. That's how bad the smog was. People were burning. It blew me. So I went into my general manager and I said, "Can you burn in Springfield?" He said, "Yeah, you can burn in Springfield. Can you believe that?" I mean, I was just astonished that a city of that size allowed open burning. Now, I'm guessing that they have long since banned it, but it was shocking to me that in a city like this, and this is back in the 80s, that you could still burn things. And it was probably a place in which they hadn't gotten around to banning it. You know, it's not in northern Illinois. It was in the central part of the state, and it must have been part of the culture there to do it. But I mean, it was, to me, very obnoxious, and my eyes are burning. And I mean, it was like the whole city seemed to be just nothing but smoke, like what you're seeing Los Angeles is. For the people who want to ban the burning, though, well, now they know what they don't like the burning in Brookfield. Now you know what it's like to live in California. Do you still burn things yourself? Bonfires. I mean, but do you burn things because for practical reasons, or you just burn things to burn them? Cut trees and you burn them and all of that. And probably nobody complains about it. You can't, can you burn in the village of Cedarburg, though? In the city of Cedarburg, you can't. So the guy that lives like right on the edge of town and is doing his burning is probably hacking up the people who live in the city. You're supposed to give them warning. What? Just so that they know that your house isn't burning down and not to send out the. Oh, I can imagine some people's fires get out of control out there. All right, that's enough of that. On the program yesterday, I discussed my belief that the giant tech companies are getting too big and too powerful. We're just seeing again the trend toward online retailing and the incredible growth of Amazon at the same day. It's the same day that Kohl's is announcing that they're laying off 15% of their corporate staff. Amazon is announcing that they're hiring 100,000 people. This is just one area of brick and mortar moving into the tech area. Amazon is one of the largest, if not the largest, cloud company. Microsoft is huge, a handful of others. When you take a look at Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, and a handful of other companies, they have overwhelming dominance in the field that they are in. And they're also now controlling most of the information that we are able to communicate to one another. Social media is not only the number one way in which people express their opinions, it's now the number one way in which a lot of people get their news. I think they're too big. I think they're non-competitive. I think that they are bad for America to have companies have so much of our economy concentrated in a handful of companies. The fact that they're almost all based on the West Coast, there is very little diversity of thought, and there's no longer competition in any of these fields. Who's Amazon's competitor? They don't have one. Who's Facebook's competitor? They don't really have one. There are other social media companies, but Facebook seems to own about half of them themselves. I believe that we have to consider busting them up and moving on them on antitrust levels. Interestingly, as I mentioned this on the program yesterday. Interestingly, just one day later, there's a column in today's Wall Street Journal by Phil Gramm and Jerry Elling. Some of you may remember Phil Gramm, longtime United States Senator from Texas, in which he says that this argument is misguided. He draws attention to the fact that the push toward breaking up the tech companies is coming from both the left and the right. They say that if we do it, we will lose America's domination in the tech field. And I will grant this. Tech is obviously the area of the greatest growth in global economy. And it's an industry that is overwhelmingly dominated by the United States of America. Almost all of the planet's large tech companies are based here. There's a couple that are Chinese based, but most of them are here. Apple is an American company. Facebook's an American company. Alphabet, the parent of Google, is an American company. Netflix is an American company. You take a look at the FANG stocks. Every single one of them is an American-based company. Busting them up to create more competition, Graham argues, is going to create an opening for foreign competitors to move in here, and in particular, Chinese competitors. I don't agree with them, but I grant you that it's an interesting point. That at the same time that America has lost ground in some areas, particularly industrial, President Trump has tried to address this. We overwhelmingly dominate the field of tech. We don't manufacture that much tech here, but the actual providing of it, almost all of these companies are American-based, and while they may be too big and they may be too powerful, at least they're here. What do you have on there? Unless you're a peaceful protester, then you can damn well burn anything that you want. Is that I was back in your fire thing. I wonder what the average protesters think about that. These rioters, they're burning things all the time, right? But then they move back, they go back into their residential neighborhood and they say that you shouldn't be able to burn leaves, but they think you should be able to burn down a school or something, right? Yeah, there are a lot of weird coalitions coming in here. I'm siding with the lefties on the whole antitrust thing. You can't tell me that you don't think that Facebook's too big. Paul agrees with me. Don't you think Amazon's too big? At the very least, the retailing arm of Amazon and the cloud arm of Amazon could be broken up. And again, as somebody who is a shareholder in some of these companies, the investors often do very, very well. When AT&T broke up, the people who owned stock at AT&T did spectacularly well because they ended up owning stock in, what did they call it? They called them the Baby Bells back when they split, I think 5 companies since broken up, and AT&T, of course. I think if you trace it all the way back, AT&T broke onto 5 companies. Ameritech and Southwestern Bell were 2 of them, and either Ameritech bought Southwestern Bell or Southwestern Bell bought Ameritech, and whichever one of the survivors went back and bought back AT&T and took AT&T's name. I think that's the fallout. Well, that's the thing. People like, Phil Graham's a true capitalist. I think I'm a true capitalist. That's the debate. Paul says, if you're a true capitalist, isn't it okay for a company to become enormous? But I argue capitalism and monopolies don't go hand in hand. When you have a monopolistic system in place, you no longer have capitalism. Capitalism is premised on competition. But when you have a monopoly in place, when one company dominates everything, there is no competition and capitalism ceases to work, which is why the number one capitalist system in the globe, the United States, has always had antitrust laws. And as far back as the origins of our country, we have used them when we felt some companies got to be too large and got so abusive and made it impossible for anyone to compete with them. And I'll tell you, I'm sure a whole lot of retailers right now are very, very wary of trying to exist as businesses in a world in which Amazon dominates everything. Not to mention the fact that Amazon's in so many other areas. After Netflix, what is the number one streaming service? I bet Prime is close. Netflix is probably number 1. Do you know which one's number 2? I'm now into the streaming world, so I now have some of these things. But Paul says, now YouTube TV is free, though, isn't it? See, I don't understand any of these things. But I mean, I can watch the regular things I see on YouTube for free on my TV now. That's different than buying by YouTube TV. I am so far behind the curve on these things. So there's a higher end of YouTube because I've got the YouTube little icon on my streaming thing. Paul says that gives me nothing. There's a lot of good stuff that I find in there. You can see, Springsteen has a new song out. It's getting all sorts of talk. I really, really want to be able to say that this is as good as the stuff from the Born in the USA album and from the Born to Run album. The song is called Letter to You. It's a very good song, but it's not at the same power of the greatest stuff that he did. But I wanted to see the video, so I watched it on TV last night on YouTube. But you're claiming that's not the real YouTube. That this is like Nordstrom Rack rather than the real Nordstrom. Is that what you're saying? Did you ever go to the Prangies in Sheboygan when you were a kid? Yeah. When I was a kid, we had Prangies in Appleton, and then you had Prangy Way. That was like their copyright stuff. So you're saying I have YouTube Way. I don't have the real YouTube. I think most people have the one that I have. You say people are paying for YouTube? I did not know that. And I try to be on top of these things. I guess the point that I was making on Amazon. Before I get to the break, the point that I was trying to make with regard to Amazon, they're becoming an enormous player in providing of entertainment through their Prime Video arm. Then consider that their cloud services arm is they're taking over the cloud. They're battling with Microsoft and 1 or 2 other companies for a huge share of all of the data and information that we have in the cloud. Then add in, not only are they now the dominant retailer in the world, all of that retailing that they do allows them to build these huge profiles of their customers. They know everything about all of us. They're probably already too big. In the meantime, they're begging people to come work for them. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Still to come on today's program, we're going to dive into this latest protest in Kenosha and why all of these cars were speeding down I-94 yesterday afternoon with blacked out license plates. Story has only been touched on by the local media. I have a fair amount of inside information that I want to share with you, and we're going to get to that still to come on today's program. Real quickly, there's an interesting sports story going on right now. Obviously, many people are wondering if the Bucks are going to be able to re-sign Giannis Antetokounmpo. The Bucks season has just ended. It was reported yesterday by Yahoo Sports, also reported this morning on JS Online, that Giannis met for 3 hours over the weekend with Mark Lasry, one of the three prime co-owners of the Bucks. And according to the Yahoo story, one of the things they discussed is whether or not the Bucks are willing to put together the type of payroll necessary in order to compete and win. Giannis is different than just about everybody else in the NBA in that his background, you talk about a rags to riches story. This is a kid whose family grew up in Africa and got out of terrible poverty and moved to Greece where they remained dirt poor. I mean, Giannis tells these stories about selling pencils on the sidewalks and so on. That's how poor they were. Some of the kids, particularly him, were of such incredible athletic ability that Giannis was discovered by scouts. The next thing you know, the Bucks somehow make him a first-round draft choice. He comes over to the NBA and comes over to the United States and turns himself into one of the greatest players in the world. He isn't going to have some of the same attitudes and priorities as others. He is a guy that is driven to succeed, and he really, really wants to win. You talk about a guy who's been a great role model and a great citizen. I think it would certainly be him. He wants to win. According to the Yahoo story, one of the concerns that he's expressing with the Bucks is whether or not the Bucks will put together the type of team around him that allows him to win. And if we learn anything about the way this season ended, and maybe it would have been different if you weren't playing in the bubble, if you didn't take 3 months off and so on, but that the supporting cast around Giannis wasn't good enough to win a championship. The Yahoo story says that one of the points that was discussed was the Bucks were not willing to pay the luxury tax this year. That's the reason that they allowed Malcolm Brogdon to go to Indiana. They weren't going to go over the threshold by which you have to pay the luxury tax. Mark Lasry, the Bucks co-owner, is quoted in today's newspaper as saying that the Bucks are willing to go over the tax if that cap and pay the tax if that's what's necessary. So from the perspective of Giannis, he's asking the question, look, are you going to spend enough money to put a real team around me? The other thing that's interesting in the story is they said that they discussed with Giannis, or Lasry discussed with Giannis, what types of players he would like to see on the team. Well, if you're asking somebody what types of players you would like to see on the team, it goes without saying you're also asking what types of players do you not want on the team. So I think it's fair to say, as the Bucks attempt to convince Giannis to stick around and sign an extension and stay with the Bucks rather than go to a free agency mode, that Giannis is going to be playing a very similar role to the type that Aaron Rodgers has wanted to play in Green Bay, in which he's going to have considerable input into the team's roster. I don't think that you have to fear with Giannis the notion that he would sign a contract and then be a guy that just rests on his laurels and, okay, I got my money and that's the end of me. Although, you wouldn't have thought that about Christian Yelich either. Are we at the point where there's reason to be concerned about Christian Yelich? Well, I mean, we are essentially nearly 1/3 into what a regular season would have been. The Brewers are nearly at 50 games right now. Christian Yelich is under 200. Again, no, I don't want to make any permanent judgments on anything. It's a weird season. They didn't really have spring training. A lot of baseball hitters are having terrible years. Hitting in general in baseball is way down this year. But I would not have thought Christian Yelich could bat 200 for 1/3 of a season. I mean, the guy just looked like the most natural hitter that I wasn't around when Ted Williams played, but I think his style has been that of a Ted Williams, a guy that just always made contact and would never be prone to go into a slump of more than 2 or 3 games. He got the giant contract with the Brewers, and he just can't get himself on track. I think a real test will be a full season with spring training and so on next year. And if he has a bad year again next year, then it would be a reason to be alarmed. But I think it's somewhat concerning. I don't think with Yelich it's a lack of motivation. Okay, I got my money. I don't care anymore. He just has never seemed like that kind of guy. In the same way that Aaron Rodgers is not that kind of a guy and Giannis is not that kind of a guy. It's 5:24. I want to discuss the story in Kenosha, and also we need to really peel back the scab and take a serious look at what's motivating a significant number of people that are protesting against police. We keep hearing that Black Lives Matter or anti-police protesters are peaceful. This is the description that is given to them by the media all the time, as if being, quote, peaceful means good. I will grant the following. There does need to be a differentiation between violent protesters and nonviolent protesters. There's a distinction between the types of people that have been in Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, and Kenosha, with people that simply stand around and yell and scream or march. There is a distinction. Even though both are breaking the law, you can't just block city streets. You can't just hold protests without permits. You can't go and trample on private property. There is obviously something less damaging about that type of protest when you're not destroying property and you're not injuring someone, as opposed to the out-and-out rioting that's been going on in other cities. I grant that point. However, it's about time that we start considering the attitudes and motivations of some of the protesters. And I'm not going to lump everyone together, but I'm talking about what's more than just a small number of people. And I think over the weekend in Los Angeles, we got a glimpse into the amount of hate and maybe even true evil driving some of these so-called protesters. You had 2 Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies ambushed and targeted for assassination. We're talking about a level of behavior that's beyond anything that we've seen with regard to police officers. The worst police shooting that you could find, the police officer still had some reason to be in contact. Take the Floyd situation, which wasn't a shooting, but was a police-involved death. It will be debated at his trial as to whether or not Chauvin murdered Floyd or not. But he didn't go and pick George Floyd out of nowhere and just decide, hey, I'm going to kill this guy. You had in Los Angeles 2 police officers, 2 sheriff's deputies, targeted for assassination because they're cops. Now, you can argue that that was the action of one depraved individual, in the same way that whomever it was that killed an African-American Trump supporter in Milwaukee was acting as one individual. To lump somebody who does something like that with an entire group, I grant you, is wrong. But when you have people who show up at the Los Angeles County Jail and chant, and at the hospital and chant, we hope they die, that's worthy of note. It wasn't just 2 or 3 people. They were willing publicly, with cameras pointed at them, to chant, we hope they die. You can't just pretend that that didn't happen. Can you imagine what the reaction would have been had a police officer shot a suspect and a bunch of cops showed up at the hospital and chanted, we hope he dies, with regard to the suspect? You'd never hear the end of it. The point that I'm raising here is that within this movement of anti-police and Black Lives Matter, at least a portion of it includes some truly hateful people who hate police officers, hate society, hate America. They really do want police officers to die. And we know they really want police officers to die because that's what they chanted. Now, fortunately, actions of people targeting cops and just shooting at them are still very rare in America. But you worry how far this is going to go. You can't find a Democrat in the United States who will condemn violent protests in the cities in which it's occurred. Now, fortunately, in Los Angeles, there was at least some level of condemnation from the mayor and the district attorney and a couple of other officials, Democrats, to the crowd that was chanting, "We hope they die," with regard to the police officers. But you wonder how many other people that are just in the Black Lives Matter movement, where have they been in condemning it? A few elected officials, yes. How many other leaders of BLM have condemned that? Not many. Now let's move to what happened in Kenosha last night. The story is a little muddled. What I can tell you based on contacts with law enforcement sources, some outside reporting and reporting in the Kenosha News, that there were, in the late afternoon hours, right around this time yesterday afternoon, flying down I-94, a lot of cars, and they appeared to be going way over the speed limit. What they shared in common is many of them had their license plates either taped over or blacked out or no plate on there at all. It's unclear if they were all going to the same place. There was a protest scheduled last night in Kenosha because it was the first protest that had been planned since the barricades were taken down around the courthouse. But there also was a demonstration that occurred at the Burlington School Board meeting last night. They've got an issue in Burlington where some parents are very upset that a teacher has decided to go rogue and has incorporated Black Lives Matter material into the school curriculum without authorization. And some people showed up at the school board meeting demanding that she be fired, and some Black Lives Matter protesters showed up in support of them and said, apparently threatened to follow home the people that were pushing for the firing of the teacher. So I don't know if all of these people were going to the same place or not. But the driving at a high rate of speed is something that those of us in Milwaukee have seen. Furthermore, the taping over of the license plates, that's scary. Why would someone tape over their license plates? It's because they don't want anybody to be able to identify what they're going to be doing. So anyway, a sheriff's deputy pulled over one of the people that was driving at a high rate of speed and had a blacked over license plate. It was a female. She had a gun in the car and it was concealed. She doesn't have a permit to carry a concealed weapon. In addition to that, according to the statement from the Kenosha County Sheriff's Department, there was marijuana in the car. So she was arrested on a number of charges, including the traffic charge, the license plate charge, and the weapons charge. And she was taken to the Kenosha County Jail. A number of protesters went to the courthouse and demanded that she be released. I have not been able to confirm who bailed her out. So I'm not going to name who I believe that it is, but I can tell you that it is someone who is prominently involved in the protests that have been going on in Wauwatosa and is someone whose name would be well known to many. But again, since I can't confirm the information and nail it down, I'm not going to go any farther than that. Suffice to say that when you have a bunch of people coming from outside of Kenosha and they black over their license plates and they're all driving at a high rate of speed knowing the best a cop can do is pull over just one of them, and at least some of those people have weapons in their cars, this is again very scary stuff. And they target, now well after the original situation that occurred with Jacob Blake in Kenosha, they target Kenosha again. This is very different from the liberals that we are used to. The liberals that we are used to are the ones that demand gun control laws and say that guns are terrible things and so on. These individuals that are involved in these protests, many of them are armed. The woman had a gun in her car, and when you see people, it's one thing to see somebody driving without a license plate, which goes on all the time. When you see people taping over their license plates, there's no way you're up to anything other than no good. I'm very pessimistic about what's going to happen in America over the next 6 to 7 weeks leading up to the election. The common denominator that we see in most of these places is the areas that are being targeted are not areas like the city of Milwaukee. Wauwatosa has been in the crosshairs of these protesters for better than 3 months. Kenosha got very violent very fast, which Wauwatosa never did. But you now wonder if there's an attempt to make Kenosha ground zero for the next several weeks. I don't know if that's the case or not. But when you start seeing people blacking over their license plates to make it very, very hard for anybody to identify them, and it's clearly coordinated when all the cars are blacked over like that, you have to wonder about whether or not there is criminal behavior that's going on that would fall into the category of a conspiracy. What were they planning to do? How many of them were armed? Why are they armed? Going back to the way I introduced the subject, to simply say, well, the people are peaceful, they're peaceful, they're peaceful, they're peaceful. Well, in Kenosha, they've not been peaceful. So therefore, if there is going to be an attempt to re-escalate the trouble down in Kenosha, it's reasons to be very, very wary. Particularly given the fact that we have a governor of this state who's, in response to what happened in Kenosha, said he wouldn't do anything any differently. Kenosha halfway burned to the ground, and Tony Evers says he wouldn't do anything any differently. Well, let's imagine it starts up again. Are we not going to do anything differently this time around? And what happens if they decide to put another community in the crosshairs here? Blacking over your license plate, arming yourself, driving in a caravan all at a high rate of speed. That's scary behavior. And I think all of us want, or most of us want, to avoid some city in Wisconsin becoming what's happened in Portland, or some of the communities that have been under siege for months because local officials won't do anything to stop it. One of those stories that, Morris Gibbs' name is actually spelled like Maurice. Read all these stories that he insisted that it be pronounced Morris because he thought Maurice was too effeminate. If there's anything to that, or is that just a British affectation, right? Were they Australian or British? I don't remember the Bee Gees. There was something, but that was one of those things that was discussed way back in the day. Should I only bring up stuff discussed way back in the day? Why does Maurice Gibb pronounce his name Morris? The suggestion was that he just was adamant that when anybody would call him Maurice, he would always correct him and say it's Morris. Anyway, I'm going to play another cut of Joe Biden today from the campaign trail, and I just want you to listen to it. Paul, you ready?
Harris-Biden administration is going to relaunch that effort and keep pushing further to make it easier for military spouses and veterans to find meaningful careers, to ensure teachers know how to support military children in their classrooms, and to improve support for caregivers and survivors so much more than we do now.
Now, there you heard the cut. First of all, they don't even make an attempt to make it appear as though Joe Biden is doing anything other than reading. That was delivered in an unbelievably monotone fashion, and it was very, very hard for me the first time I heard it to even understand what the subject was that he was talking about. He's prattling on about caregivers for the military and education and so on, but there was no enunciation, there was no inflection, there was no varying of delivery. He was just reading something that was clearly written for him. And I think they've even given up trying to make it appear as though Biden is delivering anything natural, given the fact that that was obviously so canned and obviously just written off a script. Can you play it again, by the way, or not? I want you to listen to it again.
Harris-Biden administration is going to relaunch that effort and keep pushing.
He called it a Harris-Biden administration. Now, on the one hand, you can simply say, here's Idiot Joe with yet another gaffe. He doesn't even understand that he's at the top of the ticket for the first time in his life, except he did read the rest of the thing flawlessly. And you can tell that he's just reading it because he doesn't inflect anything. He's not trying to think as he goes along to put in any kind of a pausing or anything. He's just reading off the script. So if he's just reading everything off the script, how does he flip around and make that mistake? Is it possible it was deliberate? Now, I don't know. Whoever would have thought, and the Biden campaign, by the way, is saying that it was simply a mistake on Joe's part saying this. Who would have thought that it's now gotten to the point where the Biden people are actually claiming that Biden's gaffes are gaffes rather than denying that they're gaffes? Yesterday, Kamala Harris referred to the Harris administration. If this happens 2 more times this week, then we've got to start taking note of it. You know, you could say Kamala Harris, who ran for president herself, is so used to these speeches to referring to her coming president. She, when she was a candidate herself, she said the Harris administration. Maybe it's just a slip. Joe, who's been so used to being part of the Obama-Biden administration and is so probably unaccustomed to being at the head of the ticket, he might just misstate things and flip it around and say Harris-Biden, particularly given the fact that Joe usually doesn't know what country he's in. Except for the fact that this is now both of them doing it a day apart, and do they have polling that indicates that an increasing number of Americans are truly concerned that Joe has lost it? And are they trying to essentially imply, look, everybody knows Kamala is really going to be the president, Joe's still on the ballot, but it's going to be a Kamala Harris administration? I don't know the answer to that. But it sure is curious that both of them, within a space of 2 days, managed to put the wrong person at the head of the ticket. Now, if it doesn't happen again, it's probably just a mistake. But if Joe slips up 2 or 3 more times, or Kamala says it 2 or 3 more times herself, then you've got to take note that it is deliberate and they are trying to plant the seed out there that wink, wink, nod, nod. Don't worry about crazy Joe actually having his finger on the button. You're really nominating Kamala to be the president of the United States, and Joe is going to bow out either sometime before or after the election. No, that's not necessary. One of the more interesting news voices to come out in the last several months has been Gerard Baker. He's the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, and he got kicked upstairs some time ago, Ed. He's now writing a column, and he's been focusing on bias in the media and has, I think, become an extremely effective voice on it. His column in today's Wall Street Journal deals with a point that Tucker Carlson's been focusing on a lot, and so has Laura Ingraham. They're referring to the media now no longer reporting news, but instead reporting a narrative. The narrative means, in other words, we decide what the storyline is, and everything else is simply created to fit whatever that predetermined narrative is. Protests are peaceful. COVID is deadly. Trump's a moron. Whatever the narrative is, you then take any story that comes down after the point and feed it into that narrative that you decided to put out in the first place. Well, what happens when the narrative changes? I want you to think about this, the following point during the break. Have Democrats always been fans of mail-in voting? News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. I mentioned the Gerard Baker column in today's Wall Street Journal. It's really good. You need to listen to the opening of the column closely. Listen to the first sentence. Voting by mail is now common enough and problematic enough that election experts say there have been multiple elections in which no one can say with confidence which candidate was the deserved winner. Another presidential tweet Some right-wing pundit promoting a debunked theory about mail-in ballots in an effort to delegitimize the election? Try the New York Times. In a front-page news story published just before the 2012 presidential election, the Times cast grave doubt on the reliability of widespread mail-in voting, noting it was much more vulnerable to fraud than conventional voting. Quote, while fraud in voting by mail is far less common than innocent errors, it is vastly more prevalent than in-person voting fraud. Times change. Last month, the same paper ran a headline that said, Trump is pushing a false argument on vote-by-mail fraud. It's possible, I suppose, that all that fraud the paper worried about has just disappeared in 8 years. But the real clue as to why the Times, along with virtually the entire media, now says claims about mail-in fraud are false, comes further down in that October 12, 2012 news item. Quote, Republicans are in fact more likely than Democrats to vote absentee. In the 2008 general election in Florida, 47% of absentee votes were by Republicans and 36% of absentee voters were Democrats. Well, there you have it. When voting by mail seemed to be a Republican thing, it was fraud, manipulation. Now that Democrats are expected to vote this way in much greater numbers, it's all nothing to see here. Liberals in the media and the political establishment used to poke fun at conservatives who supposedly ignored evidence, data, and facts on things like climate change. But we all knew the media simply chose the facts that suited its own narrative and picked another set when they were no longer convenient. Now it's transparent. To the mail-in mirage in the past month, we can add the Sturgis motorcycle nightmare and the 93% peaceful riot in the category of selective, tendentious, and downright fraudulent data selection by the people who control much of our national discourse. You'll recall that researchers at something called the IZA Institute of Labor Economics recently discovered that the rally in South Dakota last month, which attracted the usual massive crowd of bikers from across the country, was somehow responsible for more than 260,000 cases of COVID-19 around the country. Various news organizations seized on this report as yet more evidence of the irredeemable stupidity, arrogance, and disdain of science of your typical, presumably white, Trump-supporting biker. Those same news organizations had looked on in awed reverence as millions of Americans rallied all summer in support of Black Lives Matter, with nary a mention of any risk of coronavirus transmission. Conservatives are sometimes mocked for a faith-based approach to science in matters such as intelligent design. But from a scientific perspective, much of the media's performance over the Sturgis BLM contrast was straight out of Exodus. It was as if God's chosen people, the protesters, had been spared death through the modern-day equivalent of daubing sheep's blood on their doors, sporting a BLM bandana perhaps, while their evil motorbike riding oppressors had been struck down by God's wrath. The Sturgis research, in fact, did not withstand a moment's scrutiny, but the larger lesson was delivered. Only adherence to the faith will save you. Then there was another report last month that found 93% of the BLM protests over the summer were, quote, peaceful. The report by an organization called U.S. in Crisis, there's a clue somewhere in the name if you look hard enough, was taken by most of the media as proof that their claims of mostly peaceful protests were correct. Only a small minority had been marred by violence. Now, 93% sounds like a big number. If your child got that on a math test, you'd be glowing with pride. But there are other contexts. If we avoided getting hit by a car only 93% of the time we crossed the road, most of us wouldn't make it to our 5th birthday. And of course, 93 is a much smaller number percentage than, say, 99.9. Or shall we say 7% is a much larger percentage than 0.1, which is the proportion of black homicide victims last year who weren't unarmed and killed by the police. And yet, we are told by the media that the latter number represents a culture of systemic police brutality, or in the words of Naomi Osaka, the newly crowned U.S. Open women's tennis champion, the continued genocide of black people. But who needs things like evidence and data when there's a story to promote? Now, that's Gerard Baker, today's Wall Street Journal. We don't link up Wall Street Journal pieces on Belling.com because of the problems that I mentioned about being behind a paywall. So if you want to find it, it is in the Wall Street Journal if you have access to the material that is in there. Now, I thought that was a very interesting column and very well written. Baker's point is this. The media decides what the narrative is. The narrative in the one case, Black Lives Matter protests are peaceful. So they then grab whatever statistic they can and put it into a context that tries to prove their original point. Or, why, it's terribly reckless, those people gathering out in Sturgis, South Dakota. So they find one goofball study, since discredited, that says 260,000 people got the virus because of the Sturgis rally. In other words, they wanted to rag on the Sturgis rally, so the instant that somebody put out a study, even if that study was crapola, that becomes the thing they jump on because it proves the original point. The narrative is the Sturgis rally is dangerous. On the other hand, they don't want to argue that the Black Lives Matter protesters are engaging in dangerous behavior that might cause the spread of COVID-19, so therefore there's no mention of any study having anything to do with that. The point of all of this is that we no longer have a reporting of news. We have a media that decides what conclusion we're supposed to draw and then goes out and cherry picks events of the day to try to lead us to the conclusion that they came up with in the first place. I like to analogize. Let's do it this way. Let's imagine Paul's on trial for murder. Well, and let's imagine I'm his lawyer. Now, I'd be tempted to just say, yeah, the goof did it. But if I want to win my case because I'm a lawyer that cares about the results that I get, when I present the case that Paul didn't commit the murder, I'm only going to grab out the information that would seem to point to somebody else doing it. Put it the other way. If I'm the prosecuting attorney, the evidence that I'm going to present to the jury is all of the evidence that I had that Paul actually did it. But that's the point. In a trial, the lawyers are advocates. The prosecutor's trying to prove that somebody did it. The defense attorney is trying to clear the individual. What the media has become is an advocate. They create the narrative in advance, and then the news of the day is simply grabbing the information that they can use to fit into the narrative. If the information that's out there doesn't fit into the narrative, the story is either ignored or dramatically downplayed. If the story fits into the narrative, then we're going to run with it. We will roll with it. Thus, the focus on protests that are so-called peaceful and the kind of ignoring the fact that some aren't. The grabbing a number, well, 93% of them are peaceful. I love that. I would say if you kind of come up with any movement that's out there and say that 7% of the protests and then fill in the blank of the group are violent, that's a pretty high number. So they grab the 93. The narrative is the story. That's the role of the American media. Trump is stupid. Let's grab all the stories that prove that Trump is stupid. Trump is reckless. Trump's not going to be able to act on the international stage. Well, then we get an event like the one this afternoon in which Israel, for the first time ever, is recognized by two Arab nations. We've got to de-emphasize that because Trump's fingerprints were all over that story, and it doesn't fit the narrative that Trump is stupid and Trump is never going to be able to do anything on the international stage. Likewise, had Barack Obama as president gotten a number of Arab nations to recognize Israel, like I said, he would be nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes. Ron Johnson is, by the way, suggesting that President Trump receive the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that he has done in the Middle East. I think you can make the case that history will regard President Trump's attempts to disconnect the United States militarily from these skirmishes that we've been involved in for the longest time might end up being something that eventually liberals will credit him for once we move into the sphere of history. And that's the thing about the lefties. The Republicans they hate are always the ones that are in power now. And if the next Republican president in 2024, 2028 comes down the pike and decides to govern a little bit more from the right, they're going to go back and they'll remember Trump somewhat fondly, say, well, Donald Trump did a lot of things that are moderate. Donald Trump did this, and the suddenly monstrous Donald Trump will become more reasonable. The same thing happened to Tommy Thompson when Rebecca Clayfish or whomever runs for the Republican nomination for governor in 2 years is going to be out there. They'll trash that person as not being as pragmatic as Scott Walker, who didn't do so forth and such and such. Anyway, the point to be taken from all of this, and the point of Baker's column is, the media decides what the story is in advance. And once they decide what the story is in advance, all they do each individual day is to try to come up with individual nuggets of information that prove their predetermined conclusion on the story. 618. I've got an example, actually, of that in the final topic that we have on the program, and we'll do that one next. 618 News Talk 1130 WIS. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Final thought on narratives. One of the narratives that we've had for a number of years has been that Republicans try to disenfranchise liberals when it comes to voting, that we put up all of these obstacles to make it hard for liberals to be able to vote. Photo IDs for voting, this disproportionately disenfranchises minority voters and the poor and the elderly and so on. That liberals are constantly disenfranchising people and trying to make it harder for people to be able to vote for the candidates of their choice. Yet, we actually now have a case of disenfranchising leftist voters. The Green Party's presidential and vice presidential candidates are thrown off the Wisconsin ballot. The Green Party candidate for president got 31,000 votes in Wisconsin in 2016, and every one of those 31,000 was a leftist, because the Green Party is even to the left of the Democratic Party. And the people who wanted the Green Party thrown off the ballot are Democrats. The staff of the State Election Commission and the Democratic members of the commission voted to throw the Green Party off the ballot. Yet, a case of actual disenfranchisement of leftists, the liberals who would have preferred to vote for the Green Party candidate for this president this time around, and the actual Green Party candidate for president and vice president, an actual case of them being disenfranchised, doesn't seem to raise the hackles of our liberals at all. Why? Because the beneficiaries of this are Democrats. One can imagine if John Kasich had decided to run for president as a third-party candidate, and the fear that he would have bled off some moderate Republicans, a small number at least away from President Trump's margin. If Republicans succeeded in throwing Kasich off the ballot, you can imagine the screams and yelps from leftists over that. Instead, they managed to throw a liberal third party off the ballot and get the state Supreme Court to back them up, and suddenly we don't have any concern about disenfranchisement at all. Anyway, on that ruling, we talked at some length about it on yesterday's program. The three liberals on the court voted one way. The three conservatives voted to restore the Green Party candidates to the ballot, and Brian Hagedorn, who ran for office as a conservative 2 years ago, went over and joined with the liberals again. I mentioned that this has happened more than enough times now for us to think that it was simply quirky, and there has to be very serious concern that Hagedorn is not a conservative justice, that he's something like John Roberts is at the national level, somebody who's going to vote with the liberals half the time and vote with conservatives half the time, meaning the state Supreme Court might already be under leftist control if Hagedorn goes that way more than half the time. The three conservatives, in their dissenting opinions on the Green Party case, mocked the ruling of the majority. The majority, joined by Hagedorn, concluded that even if the Green Party candidate was wrongly kicked off the ballot, it's simply too late to do anything about it. That we have to print out the absentee ballots now. We don't have time to readdress this and reprint all the ballots of the state to put the Green Party candidates on. Imagine that. Imagine a Supreme Court of a state, ours, saying, we think these candidates were wrongly denied the opportunity to be on an American ballot, but we're not going to do anything about it. You can't come up with a more obvious case of disenfranchisement. But going back to our narratives, given the fact that the beneficiaries here are liberals, I guess it's not a problem. On the whole Hagedorn thing, there's not been a lot of mention from many Republicans in the state about this. Privately, I know a lot of people are muttering and wondering whether or not we were conned by Hagedorn and his supporters when he ran for office the first time around. Remember when these conservatives run for the state Supreme Court, there's only ever one of them that is on the ballot. Everybody gets together, the leaders of the Republican Party, the leaders of the conservative movement, they decide who the statewide candidate is going to be. And Brian Hagedorn assured a lot of people that he was going to govern and rule as a conservative when he was on that court. So if he turns out to be something other than that, it is certainly fair to conclude that he lied to a lot of us about what his philosophy truly is. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.